And so you may find yourself in a situation where for a generic injectable, where there used to be, 10 manufacturers, now there's 2 or 3. And all it takes is one FDA inspection that walks in the door, or one finding that there's particulates in a certain vial that can shut down a line, and it can have a huge impact because those other producers are just, they don't have the capacity to meet the rest of the demand within the United States.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Greg Chavez, Senior Director of Strategic Accounts with Graphite RX, and we are going to be talking about pharmacy and shortages in pharmacy. And this is the first time that we've really dove into this topic of pharmaceuticals, and I think there's some nuances going on in the industry that Greg's going to enlighten us on in this interview today, Hays.
No doubt. Greg is an absolute pro. He's been on all sides of the spectrum. He's been on the provider side, the GPO side, manufacturer side. So he really brings a lot. And I think I'm going to convert him to be a Tennessee Titan fan.
All right. Well, stay tuned for that. We're going to be right back after a short break with Greg Chavez, Senior Director of Strategic Accounts with Graphite RX.
I'm Hays Waldrop.
This is Garry Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Greg Chavez, Senior Director of Strategic Accounts with Graphite RX, and we are going to be talking about pharmacy shortages. And so I think this is the first episode of Power Supply where we've really focused on pharmacy, but shortages, it's not really limited to pharmacy, but it's going to be a nice nuanced conversation today, Greg, and I'm really excited to have you on. And I didn't realize we had so many people in common prior to getting scheduled for this interview, but
that's interesting. Yes.
Lots of people I spoke with said great things about you. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Justin. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Greg, I got one quick question as we get started. Tell me about your weekend and maybe watching football and maybe I think the Steelers perhaps played.
Oh, gosh. Wow.
Can you tell us a little bit about, your experience watching maybe, what was it, the Chiefs, I believe, right?
I think it was, I recall it was the Chiefs. Yeah, I think, well, you know what? I went in with very slight expectations. So the fact they even got some numbers on the board, I was happy with
Big
that.
Ben,
but,
baby.
I think Ben was rolling out. So I think they kind of lost their momentum there a while back. But, it was a good run. I thought it was, great years with that guy. I got to see him play in person several times. So I was fortunate to have that at least down at Three Rivers.
Nice.
Loved it.
Perfect.
Great.
Perfect.
So, Greg, why don't you give us a little bit of background on your experience, because I think you've got quite a bit of applicable experience, and you've also worked in the GPO world as well. So you can see this, I think, from multiple different perspectives as we start the discussion today.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Yeah, so I've been fortunate enough that I've, in my career path since graduating from pharmacy school, I've had the opportunity to work on pretty much every level of pharmacy as it relates to supply chain. So, from working as a hospital pharmacy manager and director and senior director at certain levels, at that place where, the medications actually get to the patient. So I've been there. I've been on the payer side with Medco. So I see what goes on behind the scenes there from a payer perspective. perspective and how they manage those formularies. I've ran a Walgreens before. I've a lot of experience in the retail world, independent as well, specialty pharmacy. I've done a lot of work with that. And then just recently with my experience with the GPO. So that really kind of rounded out my experience from a supply chain perspective. So I've had buyers that reported to me from big hospital systems that I worked with, just seeing all the nuances that go on that pharmacy supply chain. It's pretty interesting.
Well, as we talk about pharmacy and supply chain and sourcing pharmaceuticals in particular, it's a little bit different, right? It's not the same as many of the other categories. And I'd like for you to kind of talk about what does make it so much different. If we're talking to somebody who's new in supply chain all the way up to managers and directors who may be more familiar with, sourcing pharmaceuticals, what do people need to know if they're just getting started, and then maybe even take us a little bit further to that more experienced level understanding of nuances about dealing with pharmaceuticals and sourcing?
Sure. Well, at first glance, pharmacy seems very linear, right? Because, everything is coded with certain NDC numbers, so national drug codes. So as far as the substitutes, things like that, you're pretty regulated on what you can and can't substitute out for certain products. So I think some of the nuances come into play when we get into those end users, and I'll talk about like hospital systems, just your local pharmacies as an example, where, when you're going to the big boxes, and I'll think of distributors like McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal. Those are the three that really jump out when we're thinking of supply chain across the United States. And what I find in that space is, when there are drug shortages, a lot of times, if you've got, let's say, for instance, your buyer or maybe yourself, you're not as experienced in that space, there's several different pathways you can go. Let's say, for instance, you go into your typical ordering system and that particular product's not there. And then you just happen to notice there's a notation on there from the distributor that it's back ordered for a particular reason. So there's a lot of investigating that needs to go on. So you got to find out, okay, so when's the potential release date? The FDA does compile a list of shortage drugs. So you can keep an eye on that. It's not always 100% accurate because it can vary from region to region. So I may have a shortage in the East Coast before it hits the West Coast. And if I've got an experienced buyer that sees things kind of coming down the pipeline, they may go out there and start buying those particular shortage products, prior to that shortage actually hitting that particular area. So having experience in that area, I think, is definitely number one. And having some type of a network that you can lean on from a buyer perspective or pharmacy perspective is also very helpful. And when I say that network, I'm thinking around the manufacturer. So a lot of the manufacturers, they have reps that they align us to. So it's really about really having good relationships with those reps, because they're the ones that will help guide you through that process. I mean, there may be an allocation out there. They may have some product in another part of the country. So there's a little bit more legwork to be done if we're in a shortage situation that a hospital, especially with medications, that there is no substitute. So if there's something out there that there's not a substitute for, you got to start looking around for it. Right now, we got two things that, that's hitting the market. So sterile water for injection is a big one, and normal saline that they use to flush lines with is another one that's causing a lot of concern out there for a lot of folks. These are your standard day-to-day medications that, you kind of take for granted in the hospital. But, when that goes short, it can cause a lot of problems within a hospital system.
Big deals, Greg, and appreciate you talking about shortages and how we deal with them. You talked about network and who you use, from your manufacturers, your reps, to your supply chain people, to the GPOs. I also think about like your P&T committees. Like when you get ready to move something forward and it's got to be changed, the regulations I always think about, it's not just like we have a sub, like in medical supplies. You talk about pharmaceuticals, it's a whole nother approval process. Can you kind of walk us through, once you get a sub or you get an option, does it have to go through P&T? Does it have to go through internal committees? How do we get it approved to move forward?
If it's something that's got similarities, I mean, there's a few things you need to take into consideration. But Gary, you're absolutely right. It's not as simple as, Greg and Gary's pharmacy that you and I can just start, bringing these products in, right? There's a lot of stakeholders. So I've got physician preferences with certain items, nursing preferences. There's a lot of different preferences that go into play, when we start talking substitutes. when I think of, a substitute that's going to be impactful, first thing I need to consider is, so what kind of shortage am I talking? Is there enough out there in the marketplace that, we can sustain ourselves, through this a 2-month period of shortage, or are we talking 6 months of shortage, or is it going to be longer than that? I know just recently a manufacturer, their FDA walked in one of their API plants, which is a active pharmacy ingredient plant, where that's where they actually make the actual molecules that then get shipped out and then get manufactured. And then the FDA was in there just recently to a large one, and they got a warning letter. They've got a lot of issues at play right now. They're going to have some issues down the road. So you got that down the stream effect. So the fact that they're getting implemented now with this regulations from the FDA, and it's going to cause some production problems at the sites there in India, which then is going to have a lasting effect here in the United States, here with some products that we're pretty dependent on. And a lot of these products, they're not your biologics or very expensive products. These kinds can be very inexpensive products, but yet at the same time necessary. Like I mentioned, sterile water is a big one. Another one, sodium chloride is another one. So saline for the flushing the lines. I mean, these are needed at the patient's bedside, because without it, there's a lot of procedures that cannot be done.
Hey, Greg, help me out for somebody who doesn't know a ton about this space. Obviously, PPE and all these other products are made, a lot of obviously are in China and Asia. Where are most of our pharmaceuticals made? You did mention India, Puerto Rico, I think. Give me a little bit of just a snapshot on that. And then also, in what role has any of the M&A happened, the acquisitions in these different companies as it relates to where they're also located?
Sure, that's a great point. So from a manufacturing perspective, the majority of the U.S. medications that we get in stateside are outsourced from other countries. Like India is a big producer, China. We get other ones from, like you mentioned, Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of plants out there. And again, it's a lot of it's around cost, because building a pharmaceutical plant here in the United States is very expensive. And if you're talking about products that are not very expensive, like say, for instance, water, normal saline, it's just kind of cost prohibitive to do those types of products. There's a lot of boutique type of manufacturers that are out there right now that are producing some biologics or some biological like medications, biosimilars we refer to them as, that are produced here in the United States. But the majority of I'll call them generic injectables, are produced overseas. And there are some companies here in the United States that are based in the United States, but again, they're limited to their capacity of how much they can make. And it's been a while since an actual pharmaceutical plant has got put up here in the United States, a full-on pharmaceutical plant of massive scale. So those are primarily kept in India and also in China for the most part, just because they're much more, it's more cost effective to have them overseas than to have them here stateside. But I'm seeing now a shift with COVID and everything. There's more thoughts about sourcing these products more locally than internationally.
So as far as like current state, you were talking about shortages around sterile water, et cetera. But what are some of the causes of that? And you also just started to tee up something there about maybe having more stateside manufacturing, for sustainability and resiliency in the future, just from what we've learned. The countries that make these things keep them for themselves when there's a shortage. So that kind of, in some areas, leaves us, at a loss for the supplies or pharmaceuticals that we need. So can you kind of round out this current state and start to take us into maybe a deeper dive on some of the challenges that we're facing?
So, as it relates to, sterile water, and sometimes it can be more speculative. So what I'm hearing for the shortage, there were some issues because pharmacy is very regulated. So when you've got an FDA inspector walks in, they find an issue with a certain product line. And as I mentioned earlier, these generic injectables, you may not have a lot of manufacturers, whereas when I was in pharmacy school, in the early 90s, mid 90s, there was lots of manufacturers of a lot of these medications like the lidocaines, bupivacaines. There was, 10 plus. And as things consolidated and companies kind of bought certain lines together, so a lot of brand name companies bought some generic companies, so there's a lot of consolidation, and they have to look at their ROI and say, okay, does this make sense to produce this particular medication? And so you may find yourself in a situation where for a generic injectable, where there used to be, 10 manufacturers, now there's 2 or 3. And all it takes is one FDA inspection that walks in the door, or one finding that there's particulates in a certain vial that can shut down a line, and it can have a huge impact because those other producers are just, they don't have the capacity to meet the rest of the demand within the United States. So that's usually what causes that buckle. And, therein lies the situation where we've got folks, going and ordering more than they need. So there's some hoarding that goes on. I'll say that happens. And that's just more for these folks that, especially at the large hospital systems, that they know that they could potentially be impacted by a shortage like that. So they try to shore up as much as they possibly can, to get them through the storm.
Greg, we're hearing a ton about the OTO, over the ocean, the cargo containers just living out in the seas, and 90 to 145 days waiting to come in at a minimum. That affects pharmaceuticals as well. And when I think about pharmaceuticals, I just don't think about the blood pressure medications or whatever we're treating. I think about all the supplies that go with it, right? So it's not just what the individual patient needs, it's what it's stored in, right? So that's affecting you as well as part of this global supply. Okay,
huge.
Speak to that a little bit too, if you would, Greg.
Yeah. So right now, you brought up a great point. What's happening right now, Gary, is there's a glass shortage.
I didn't know
so I got to put that stuff in something, right? So it's got to go in vials. So if there's a glass shortage, then we've got an issue. So I was just talking to a manufacturer that they were scrambling, trying to find a resource for their vials, their 5 and 10 cc vials. And so because of that shortage, it stops production. So they can't produce. In fact, they're waiting right now to get a cargo shipment that you just mentioned from India right now, because it's still out in the water and it's on its way here, but it got delayed. And so they're about a month behind in some of their production because of that shipping.
Greg, what's all this doing, the shortages doing to pricing? What kind of impact is that having?
Well, is within any market, anytime there's a shortage, there's going to be an uptick in pricing. And sometimes what's happening right now, I'll tell you with sterile water, it's really has jumped up to a pretty expensive price per vial. So, where we were at just under $1 or $1.20 for a vial of sterile water, now you're at $7. So, it's jumped up significantly, and it's not so much just because the prices just continue to start rising. Those folks that are having access to those products, they are able to put a premium cost on that. And sometimes, and that's why, from a GPO perspective and contractor perspective, if I've got a contract with a manufacturer, it prevents that from happening. But sometimes, like in this situation, I'm going to have to go outside of my GPO or outside of my contract with my certain manufacturer, because if I need that product, I may have to use somebody else's product. So I normally don't have a contract with that. So that's where those increase in the pricing goes. And they try to keep it down as much as possible, but it's the whole supply and demand game that we get into with those products. So yeah, pricing is definitely going up. No question about it. However, reimbursement doesn't go up. That's the problem.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Reimbursement stays the same. That doesn't change.
And you mentioned a term before. You kind of threw in boutique businesses. What is that all about?
So there are certain manufacturers that are much smaller in scale, and they will only do certain products. A lot of it falls in the biologic space. So those are products that are DNA synthesized, and they've got a pretty strong hold on the market. Again, very specific as far as what they're used for. So it's not something that the general population would see. So kind of more like your rare diseases, things like that. That's what we'll see manufacturers have a stateside manufacturing facility where they're making certain amounts, but not to the capacity where they're not in the millions producing vials. They're in the 100,000 a vial producing, which is very, very small compared to a large manufacturer. When you think about these manufacturers, whether India, China, Puerto Rico, they're supplying medications to the whole world, not just to the United States. So that stuff's going out everywhere, and everybody's got a contract on it. And so there's a lot of requirements that need to be met in order to fulfill a lot of these contract obligations. So that's where manufacturers sometimes have to get to a place where they're like, hey, we're going to put you on allocation. So instead of receiving, one case of this, you're going to get a half a case, for your time. So a lot of that goes into play as it relates to the size of the facility. And that's where, you as the director of pharmacy or your senior buyer start working with the manufacturer to get to a place to have those conversations with the manufacturer so you can at least, get your place in line, hopefully.
Well, Greg, that kind of leads to my next question. I'm a 200-bed hospital out in the middle of nowhere. I've got a GPO contract, but I don't have enough, pull with manufacturers perhaps. If I cannot get it, if I'm on allocation, what do I do? Where do I move and where do I look to go get some extra product?
So a lot of times what happens in that industry is there are some resources, as a buyer, you may look out to NPPA, which is a place where the pharmacy technicians kind of have a whole board there. I can tell you GPOs also have a network that they provide to you so you can check with some of your sister hospitals. If that fails, there's always what we refer to as the secondary market. And the secondary market is where, Hays, that, I talked about those prices increase. So these secondary markets are not manufacturers, but they're distributors that kind of got word on the street that, something's going to go short. So they bought some product, or they had a lot of them have direct shipments or direct lines already to the manufacturer. So they may have already brought some of that product in. So then they may start selling it at that cost plus than normally what those like you as a 200-bed hospital would be used to paying. But if it's something that's in dire need and short, then, usually you'll pull a trigger on that if it's causing any type of potential patient disruption.
So, there's a lot of people listening to this podcast who are really struggling to make it through this high demand and short supply in so many different areas. But as it relates to pharmacy, like, what are some best practices that we can take away from this conversation today, as people are out there in the field? I mean, it was interesting because I'm used to the holiday season being a big downtime for supply chain, and everybody is kind of taking that time off. And this year, through all the holidays, even Thanksgiving, they're just all working every single minute. Their eyes are open. And so the pace of play is just constant. I'm very concerned about just general fatigue and burnout in this area for sure. But the only thing that we can do is try to offer up some simplicity in a very complex situation. So what are some simple best practices, for frontline supply chain, maybe even on the manufacturing side? Like, how do we survive this successily?
I think with
our sanity.
Exactly. And I agree with you, Justin. Normally, this is whenever we all take our break, in December is when the manufacturers, they wind down, they get ready for their next round. But with everything that's been going on, they haven't been able to. So they've been continuing to manufacture just to meet these demands. But, I think simple steps to take. Number one, I think, is just educate yourself. So I think I would suggest if you're a pharmacy buyer, if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the FDA shortage newsletter. So you'll get that on a weekly basis. That'll come out to you. So at least you have an idea, because there may be products on there that may not be impactful to you for whatever reason, but at least you know kind of what's happening in the industry, because sometimes they might be a little bit behind as far as shortages go. It's not 100% accurate, but at least it's a great spot to start. So at least you've got a base to start off of. So at least okay, if it's a lidocaine or bupivacaine or, as I mentioned, sterile water shortage, okay, you can see that being talked about there. So you can start preparing yourself, in your pharmacy team for a potential impending hit from a supplier. And I think the next thing to do is, make sure you've got good inroads with your manufacturers, with those particular reps that you work with. They're the closest ones to that. And if you can get some information from them and build some relationships there, that's very critical. Networking with your other hospital systems. You don't want to be out on an island. You want to make sure that you've got inroads to either larger systems and vice versa. Some others, maybe some smaller systems that maybe they have extra product and they can loan you some. So there's a lot of borrowing and loaning that goes on during these times of shortages. And, this is when hospitals can really help themselves out. So I think maybe aligning to maybe a bigger network, potentially, where they may have some more resources, they may get more allocation, they may be somebody to help you out in a pinch. So I think it's really leaning on all of those types of situations to help kind of weather the storm through these shortages.
No, Greg, and you bring up some really good points. You've talked about a lot of different things, and it's really the communication, the collaboration, and just, it's not status quo anymore. I think Justin said it, insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. We've been down that road. That is not the case for 2021 or 2022 with everything that's hitting us. But
it's all new.
It is all brand new. And internally, as a supply chain guy that used to work with Pharmaceuticals, the pharmacy division, it's so just unique. It's, pharmacy and lab. It's like you have to have that knowledge base to really work with it. We talked about subs, but
you're absolutely right.
As we move down the road, you've talked about it a little bit. I think about value analysis. I don't look at price points. I mean, I'm thinking about the cost. It's just going through the roof. If I'm coming down to that director going, your cost is going through the roof. What do you do? But as we move to the horizon and we start looking at opportunities that you've discussed, if we could sum it up in a little bit of a ball in January of this year in 2022, and that'll probably pivot and morph again. But just more thoughts on communicating that internally with these hospitals. I think about it from rep, manufacturer, GPO, pharmacy support. How do we tie that all together to move it forward and to share with our end users?
Well, I think, these types of conversations we're having, I think number one is, get that out there so that, you can start kind of building your network. I'll tell you, LinkedIn is a great opportunity to go out there, connect with other buyers at other hospitals. I think you got to really kind of put yourself out there to find out, because like I mentioned in the FDA report, I mean, there may be shortages they're not mentioning yet, but I can tell you, I've known about shortages they're going to be impending just due to the fact that I had a relationship with a manufacturer and I heard about it. A good case in point is IVIG, which is an immune globulin that is used for several different modalities in the healthcare system. And it was interesting, before even FDA knew about it, I was talking to one of the manufacturers, because that particular API is gotten from blood donations. And because of COVID, a lot of people were not going in to give blood like they used to. And on top of that, the stimulus money was keeping people from having to go in to get compensated for that. And then by doing that, that caused a raw product shortage on that particular IVIG side and ended up causing some, pretty big allocations, in the last year or so. So again, it's about just keeping that network open, being very open-minded to, what's out there, trying to keep on top of any relevant data that's coming across through either the FDA. Your GPO is also a great resource to go into as well to get some information from them. And again, staying close, following the manufacturers, even on LinkedIn perspective, that's always a good place to keep close to kind of what's going on in that day-to-day space.
Podcasts are really good, aren't they, Greg?
Podcasts are great. I love podcasts. I listen to them all the
time. You said the magic words when you said LinkedIn too. Just, social media is a great way to get information quickly, see what's going on. I still think that people are not utilizing social media to its fullest, especially LinkedIn in the professional community.
I would agree with you.
What people do on the more personal platforms is debatable, but for professional sites like LinkedIn, I think there's a lot more untapped.
And I can tell you, I think that's a great point you brought up, because a lot of the, don't put everybody in this category, but a lot of pharmacy buyers they get so in the weeds with things sometimes they just don't have time. I mean, because they're busy. They hit the ground running at 5 a.m. waiting for their orders to come in. Their order comes in, they're putting it away, they're dealing with shortages, and lots of different folks kind of just at their door looking for medications. So I think it's about them carving out some time in their day so they can make a little bit of time so they can, jump into these networks and get a feel for a pulse on what's really going on out there. They really got to take time to actively create that time for themselves, because I'll tell you, it is a vacuum. I mean, you walk in that door and it is nonstop till the minute you are stepping into your car, leaving it for home, because it doesn't stop.
Yeah, and we don't have the local chapter meetings.
We don't have any anymore,
as much as we used to. So where's the networking?
It's difficult,
and you have less time to network.
It's impossible. In fact, I work with a network here in Phoenix that is run by a local senior buyer. And they usually would meet monthly, talk about everything that we're talking about. They'd be sponsored by one of the manufacturers, bring a lunch, whatever. But that's where they got a lot of networking. That's all of these different buyers from all over the valley coming together. Yeah, great roundtables, great information. And in fact, I just spoke with him a couple weeks ago. So what does it look like, going forward? He's like, I still can't run my meetings, and to get people virtually to do it, it's unfortunate. It's just not possible because they usually do these things.
It's not the same.
It's not the same. It is not the same at all, JP.
Yeah.
And
you can get the education, but you can't get the value of the networking. So that's where the social media can totally fill in that gap.
And a lot of these meetings happen after hours because there's just not enough time in the day while you're on board there at the pharmacy. So they usually do like a dinner, and because of all the social distancing, and they're even instructed by their facilities not to be getting involved in those bigger gatherings, those have all stopped. And even my national meetings, a lot of those have gone to virtual, and it's just not the same. You don't get the same. I mean, it's better than nothing, obviously, but it's not as you don't get that intrinsic information that you typically get from an in-person meeting, for sure.
Yeah, the brainstorming piece and the back and forth and the interaction, because you not necessarily thought about it in the same light as when you're just kind of bantering with somebody over dinner or coffee. It's just different, or a drink.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
This felt like a cup of coffee, Greg. This was a nice, a really nice conversation. You did an excellent job. And I think some of the takeaways from this interview are going to be really, really helpful. So I appreciate you for sharing your time and your insights.
No, this has been great. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me and get that out there. But yeah, I think this is definitely a subject that's not going away, and more to come on all these shortages. For sure.
And Greg, I was going to say, I'm excited to hear that you are such a Tennessee Titans fan.
I'm going to be now. Well, my company's based in Nashville, so.
There you go. Thank you very much. You did a great job.
Thanks, guys. You guys are awesome.
That was Greg Chavez, Senior Director of Strategic Accounts with Graphite RX. And Gary, we had a really, actually, not only a great conversation, but our first one around pharmaceuticals, but definitely not our first one talking about shortages and high demand and trying to survive this environment or even the holidays with your sanity, which I think Greg gave us some good, simple tips, ways to stay ahead of the game as much as possible. But, that whole stockpiling of excess inventory out of fear, is contributing to that. And you can understand why everybody's doing it, but it also creates some serious price increases in that secondary or that gray market. We talked through a number of that, but the thing I didn't know was going on in the pharmaceutical industry was these emerging boutique businesses or contract manufacturing that Greg was telling us about, which is really, really interesting to me. And as there is a major shift to trying to do more and more here in the States and be a little more self-reliant in sourcing moving forward, I can kind of see where that's a big piece of that puzzle.
No, Justin, you're right on. Pharmaceuticals, such a specialized area and probably the number one in spend in your hospital supply chain. He just kind of brought it to a level. He pulled in all kinds of different details to support our end users to listen to, from the GPOs to the internal to the manufacturing issues we knew about, the whole glass comment that came up again, syringes. Right. I mean, talking about syringes. I mean, that is a giant deal. You think about a diabetic patient that can get the right size syringe. Are you kidding me? I just really was impressed with Greg's dialogue, comfortableness just to share some details that we could make applicable to our end users. So just a great interview with Greg, and really appreciate him being on the show.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. That is going to do it for this week's episode, though. As a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or just search for Power Supply Podcast on your favorite podcast application. We also have bonus content for certain episodes, but you got to download our smartphone app. That's available for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to us here at the show. And on behalf of Hays, Garry, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.